Hello and welcome once again to the Department of Theology and Religious Studies here in the University of Nottingham and another of our Why Study series. With me today is Professor Richard Bell, and he is going to try to answer the question, why study Romans? Richard, you're very welcome.
Well, why study Romans? Well, first of all, it's actually quite a difficult text. So there's no point in studying things that are straightforward. You need something that's going to stretch you intellectually if you're going to study, especially at university, say. Another reason why I want to study it is that this text has had incredible influence. In fact, I'll stick my neck out here and say it's perhaps the one theological text which has had more influence than any other single theological text, right from the early church, right through to the 20th and 21st century. So that's another reason. And another reason to study it is that it's actually very interesting, as I hope I'll be able to put forward to you all. And perhaps I can just say something about the content of the letter, just to say why it is so arresting. The theme of the letter, you could say, is the righteousness of God. So Paul talks about this righteousness of God in chapter 1, verse 17, which he says is revealed in the gospel. Now, when he talks about the gospel, we're not talking about the gospel of Matthew. He's talking simply about the good news of Jesus Christ. And he says that in the gospel, this righteousness of God is revealed. Now, there's been a lot of controversy as to what this expression righteousness of God means. So in the medieval period, many people would understand this as the justice of God in punishing sinners. But in fact, the righteousness of God in the letter to the Romans is a very positive idea. And the best way, I think, of getting this over is that it means the salvation of God, the salvation of God. And so what he says is that this is actually revealed in the gospel. Now, if you're going to talk about the salvation of God, you then have to ask, well, do we need to be saved? Now, Paul begins the letter with a very important section. Now, it begins from chapter 1, verse 18, through to chapter 3, verse 20. And here, you could say, is the most depressing part of the letter. And he's trying to put over the idea that the whole of humanity suffers under the power of sin. So Paul talks about sin not in the sense of the sins that people commit, individual sins like lying or stealing or committing adultery. He sees sin as almost like a mythological entity. And he says that human beings are suffering under the power of sin. So when he comes to chapter 3, verse 9, he says that all, Jews and Gentiles, are under the power of sin. And in this section, he says that because people are under this power of sin, they therefore need redemption. And his key point when he comes to the end of this section, that's chapter 3, verse 20, is that there is no salvation by works of law. So the term he uses is no justification. No one can be justified by works of law. Now, justification in a way can be understood as salvation. So the essential point he's putting over is that nobody can be saved by doing good works. And this is obviously related to this idea that the whole of humanity is suffering under the power of sin. So this is really putting forth the bad news. So once he's put forward the bad news, he then has the opportunity to put forward the good news. So if you look at the text, you find that in chapter 3, verse 21, there's a big turning point where he says, but now a righteousness of God has been revealed. And he now talks about this righteousness of God, this salvation of God. Now the next section of the letter, let's take 3:21 to 3:26. In a way is the heart of the letter. It's extremely difficult, and anybody who wants to study it, you should look at many, many different commentaries. If you have Greek, study the Greek very, very carefully. And the essence of this really is that people can be saved because of the death of Christ. And the death of Christ, Paul understands as a sacrifice for sin. Now, in order to understand the way in which Christ is a sacrifice, you have to understand something of the book of Leviticus and other texts in the Old Testament, because this is the background which Paul is using. And in the Old Testament, in Leviticus, say, you get a special offering called the sin offering. And this is where an animal is taken. Usually the Israelites would place their hands on this animal. The animal would be slaughtered, and then the blood of the animal would be taken into the holy place. Either it could be smeared on the horns of the altar, or it could be sprinkled on what's called the mercy seat. And in the Greek Old Testament, the mercy seat is called the hilasterion. Now, the way in which these Levitical sacrifices would therefore operate is in this way. By laying on the hands on the sacrificial animal, that was an act of identification. The death of the sacrificial animal would, in a sense, be the death of the Israelite, and then the blood was taken into a holy place. And so the end of this sacrifice would be an entirely positive idea. And so it means the Israelite finally has fellowship with God. Now, Paul applies this idea in Romans 3 and also in Romans 8, verse 3, in fact, as well. Because in Romans 8, verse 3, he talks about Christ being sent as a sin offering. And so he applies this logic of the Levitical sacrifices to the death of Christ. And the idea he puts forward is this, and this is the nub, really, of the issue. The human beings are identified with Christ through faith. When Christ dies, those who are joined to him die with him, and subsequently they rise to new life with him. And so this is Paul's view of the atonement. Christ's death as a sacrifice for sin. We are identified with this sacrifice. We die with Christ and we rise again. And so we get this section, therefore, chapter 3, verses 21 to 26, talking about the death of Christ and, by implication, the way in which human beings can be renewed. Now, later on in the letter, you then come from this you move from this very depressing opening, 118 to 320, to this most wonderful sections where he talks about the renewal of the human being. So Paul's vision is not simply that sins are removed from the human being, but rather that the human being himself is entirely renewed. And Paul has this wonderful vision in chapter 8 that because of what Christ has done through his death and resurrection, not only is the individual Christian renewed, but the whole of creation also can look forward to a very, very bright future. The whole of creation, he says, will be renewed. So we get this whole sweep. Now, from chapters 9 to 11, Paul faces a very difficult issue. Remember that Paul himself was a Jew who came to faith in Christ. This letter was addressed to the Christians in Rome. It's very, very interesting that the early Christians in Rome, in the first century, were living in Jewish areas. And so a Christian may be living perhaps even next door to a Jewish person. And one of the issues that Paul has to face in Romans 9 to 11 is the issue of Israel. Why has Israel not believed in Christ? All the promises of the Old Testament were for Israel, and yet for some reason Israel has not accepted those promises. And so Paul then has this very difficult section. Again, if you're studying Romans 9 to 11, you need to use commentaries, very good commentaries. If you have Greek, use the Greek as well. And what Paul argues is that it was in God's purposes that Israel should not believe in Christ. And the reason for this is such that the gospel can then go to the Gentile people. But he says that in the last days, Israel will actually come to faith. And there's a most amazing verse in Romans 11, chapter 26, where Paul says all Israel will be saved. And he seems to be saying that at the second coming, when Christ comes again, all Israel will be saved, and they will be saved because they will receive the gospel directly from Christ, and the whole of Israel will be renewed.
So what you're saying is that Paul, in writing the letter to the Romans, on the one hand, he is seeking a rationale for the coming of Jesus.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, he's actually thinking of the end times.
Yeah.
So would it be fair to say, and to try and sum up, that in the letter to the Romans, we have actually Paul not only being thinking of Christian origins, but Christian end times?
Yeah, very much so. And I think the thing to imagine is that, I mean, theologians talk about eschatology, the doctrine of the last things. And the point which one has to grasp is that Paul's thinking is through and through eschatological. So he's writing Romans between, say perhaps 55 AD, 57 AD. He can say, now we're living in the last times. So his thinking is eschatological through and through. So you're absolutely right, Tom.
Richard, it's been wonderful having you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tom.